Welcome, friends, to the 12th PESIC Colloquium on Sustainable Agriculture. My name is Matt Liebman, and I serve as a Henry A. Wallace Endowed Chair for Sustainable Agriculture and a Professor of Agronomy here at Iowa State. Tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Earl Ellis, a leading theorist of what is called the Anthropocene, the geologic epoch of humans on Earth. Professor Ellis is on the faculty of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County campus in the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems, and he directs the Laboratory for Anthropogenic Landscape Ecology. Anthropogenic landscapes have been defined as areas of Earth's terrestrial surface where direct human alteration of ecological patterns and processes is profound, ongoing, and directed towards servicing the needs of human populations for food, fuel, fiber, timber, shelter, trade, and recreation. Professor Ellis's research work focuses on the ecology of human-managed ecosystems at local, regional, and global scales and is directed by special concerns over nutrient limitations to food security and how landscapes can be managed to overcome those limitations without damaging local and global environments. Dr. Ellis has studied nitrogen cycling and agroecosystem management in Chinese villages, as well as long-term changes in carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus storage in Chinese landscapes going through a transition from traditional to industrial-based agricultural systems. At present, he's engaged in a global analysis of human ecosystem interactions and in high-resolution mapping in anthropogenic landscapes. Methods and technologies used in this work include remote sensing, global positioning systems, geographic information systems, household surveys, expert and elder interviews, and a variety of ecological field methods, including vegetation and soil sampling and analysis. All this comes together in the pursuit of his main goal, informing sustainable stewardship of the biosphere in the Anthropocene. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Ellis to Iowa State University as a speaker at the PESIC Colloquium. The PESIC Colloquium honors the work, commitment, and contributions of John Pesich, Iowa State University Emeritus Professor of Agronomy. Dr. Pesic's work in the areas of soil fertility and crop production led scientists to a better understanding of the effects of agricultural management practices on the environment and crop production. Dr. Pesich also addressed through a long career in considerable depth and breadth the challenges and diverse paths to agricultural sustainability. Dr. Ellis's visit to Iowa State has been made possible by the work of Marcia Manier, and I'm very thankful to her for all that she's done. It's also been made possible by generous donations from the Bioeconomy Institute, the Plant Sciences Institute, the Graduate Program in Sustainable Agriculture, the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, the Departments of Agronomy, Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology, the Practical Farmers of Iowa, and the ISU Committee on Lectures. On behalf of the PESIC Colloquium Committee, I express my sincere thanks to all of these organizations for their assistance and support. Please join me in welcoming Earl Ellis to Iowa State University.
Good evening, and I have to thank the organizers for this wonderful opportunity to get away from Baltimore during some of its perhaps more dramatic moments. And I'm especially honored to be speaking to a distinguished group here at Iowa State University, which I think the world recognizes as one of the most powerful centers of knowledge and understanding for agriculture, which, as I'm going to talk about today, is essentially the largest change that humans have introduced into the biosphere in its history. It's currently essentially either the problem or the solution that humans are going to need to rely on as we move past 7 billion toward 9 billion. So it plays essentially the central role in understanding how we're going to build a sustainable human ecology through what I hope, and I think all of you should hope, is going to be a very long sojourn of human civilization on this planet. So probably the first thing a lot of you will wonder about is what is the meaning of this term Anthropocene, this epoch, geological epoch humans have created. And I'll introduce that concept in a moment. with the idea of trying to assess when would such a time period begin. And I think many of us are used to thinking about the global changes that we've implemented recently, such as global warming caused by the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But there's actually a precedent for a very long history of human alteration of the biosphere that would also categorize itself well in looking at human transformation of the planet. So I'll talk about when the Anthropocene began. I'll talk about the emergence of an Anthropocene biosphere, an anthropogenic biosphere, a biosphere fully reshaped by human activity over the long term. And then I'll talk about the structure of the biosphere that we've created. And as you'll see, it's much more complicated than just a biosphere that's been damaged or destroyed, but it's a biosphere that's been created and sustained by generations. Thousands of years of humans have reshaped the biosphere, and they've made certain patterns that I think we can see almost everywhere and are important to understanding how to manage it better in the future. And then I'll finish up with some ideas and lessons, especially coming from my point of view. And I consider myself primarily an ecologist, a landscape ecologist, and also a global ecologist. But I do have strong roots in agriculture. That's really where I got my start and interest in ecology and anthropogenic ecology, is understanding these very long sustained patterns of agricultural activity. So we'll finish off by talking about that. For any of you who have taken a course in ecology or environmental science, or taught a course in this, when we talk about the biosphere, the life on Earth, the patterns of life on Earth, essentially sustained by the long-term interactions and evolution of organisms in response to the global patterns of the climate system, we think of the terrestrial biomes and the wild biospheric patterns. And these are very familiar to everyone. In fact, right here, right, we would have grasslands, maybe some savannas, and if you go globally, you're going to look at deserts and tropical rainforests. There's these patterns that define the very big, broad brushstrokes for the diversity of life on Earth. But what is becoming more and more evident is that the global patterns that we think of as purely driven by these patterns of climate have been altered even since prehistory, before agriculture, by other human activities. And one of the classic examples of this occurring before the last ice age, before the Holocene, the last geological epoch, the one we currently are in, unless you accept the idea that we have joined the Anthropocene, a new epoch. So 15,000 years ago and before, humans caused the extinctions of megafauna. These are some of them large predators, some of them large herbivores on most continents. And with the main exception being Africa, where you still see, lions and elephants. Well, you had those here as well before humans arrived. Now, there's some controversy about whether or not most of these extinctions, and whether specific of these extinctions, were caused by hunting or changing the habitat of these species by burning. But the bottom line is that we know that these occurred a long time ago, that they had very powerful effects on all the ecosystems in which these occurred. For example, when the large herbivores come out of play, you often see the regrowth of forests in areas where you wouldn't have seen them otherwise, or where you have large carnivores being taken out of the system, you see recoveries of vegetation of different types. So they have a very big effect on the structure of the biosphere. But nevertheless, this is a poor choice for looking at the beginning of a big human effect on the biosphere and on the planet, because these things look a lot like what climate does. A lot of species extinctions have occurred without people, partly because of glacial changes, right? Big changes in the climate system that have driven these species to extinction. So it's not the perfect effect. So what I'm going to get into now is what is considered one of the more controversial aspects of global climate change caused by humans in more recent times, okay? But I'm not talking about such recent times. If you look at the last 1,000 years, we're all familiar with this so-called hockey stick graph, which shows global temperatures at the beginning there from ice cores and looking at tree rings and this sort of thing, and then getting into more recent times, much better data from thermometers, where you see global temperatures rising in the very recent times. And I think we all know, right, this is primarily ascribed to the activities of humans in burning fossil fuels and making cement and some of the other activities that we do that cause greenhouse gas emissions at very large scales of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide that are driving that recent climate change. What is also familiar to those who study climate change is that there's also an effect on the greenhouse gas emissions of changing the way we use land. Essentially, if you have an untouched piece of land, say whether it's a grassland or a forest, by burning off or tilling up the native vegetation, you cause a very large release of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Of course, if you let that restore again, that carbon can be reabsorbed. But if there's a net effect of land clearing, you're going to see a net emission of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So humans can cause climate change not just from burning fossil fuels, but also from tilling soil and clearing vegetation. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is to take a step back and look at a little bit bigger picture of time, temperature, and the greenhouse gases. And if you look here, what you're seeing is pretty conventional data looking at the records of temperature reconstructed, in this case in this very longer term, from looking at isotopes in ocean water and some of the precipitates there. So it's kind of a technical record. And then some of the estimates for greenhouse gases during those periods. And what you see there is a very dynamic climate, right? The last 10,000 years of the Holocene, this recent climate period, has been one of the most stable climate periods in Earth's history. In fact, it may be the most stable climate in Earth's history that we know of. So going back before that period, it's very common for the Earth to go in and out of ice ages. You see the cold periods there, and you also see the warm periods, right? And these cycles last approximately 10 to 15,000 of years, and there's many of them. So what a colleague of mine, Bill Rudiman, did was he looked at the different patterns of this going through a cooling glacial period to an interglacial period, this warm period, which is caused by, and this is known fairly well by climatologists, caused by what are called the Milankovitch cycles. But the simple thing is that you basically have these cycles of solar forcing. The sun basically, because of orbital deviations over these very long time periods, is stronger during some periods and weaker in others, and goes through a cycle. And this is what drives that cycling of temperature and the greenhouse gases, in some ways following, in some cases enforcing that effect. So if you look at that cycle, which is natural, and then you look at the other panel here where you're looking at the greenhouse gases, you also see a cycle. And you see kind of a messy thing there. It's very messy, very hard to pick up a pattern there. But if you look carefully, you'll see all of those patterns there, except for one, the red one. The Holocene, the recent one, follows a general downward trend. What's exceptional is that in the Holocene, this recent geological epoch, the most recent time period, instead of the greenhouse gases just gradually declining away from the period where you have the initial warming, away from the frozen period, through the warm period, usually you see a gradual lowering of the greenhouse gases and a gradual cooling, and then another ice age. Okay, if you look at the Holocene, we see something exceptional, which is a gradual rise in, it looks intense there, but remember, those are thousands of years, not decades like they are now. Those are over a very long time period. Instead of the greenhouse gas, in this case we're looking at methane, but carbon dioxide follows a very similar trend. You see a decline followed by an increase. Okay, so the idea is that the Holocene is anomalous. It's unusual. And what Bill Rudiman did is he built a hypothesis around this, saying that humans did it. And this is called, actually by him, he calls it the early anthropogenic hypothesis, because it was formulated before the concept of the Anthropocene became a popular term. It's been renamed popularly by other scientists the early Anthropocene hypothesis. And this is the idea that humans essentially set the climate system of the Earth on a new track, deviating from any previous glacial period in history by introducing land clearing, burning, and tillage to the Earth system about the early to mid-Holocene, this about 5,000 year ago period, leading to a gradual increase in greenhouse gases instead of a gradual decline, which would be expected. And obviously this is controversial. You probably haven't heard of it because it's most popularly discussed in Nature and Science with various climatologists trying to disprove Rudiman. It's become a popular thing. And He has been disputed many times, and I think he's still standing with his hypothesis. It's very hard to disprove at this point. But one of the main claims that was levied against it, which is a very obvious, reasonable claim, and that sheds a lot of light on the way that humans have transformed the biosphere, is the claim that so few people, 5,000 years ago, we only had a few million people on Earth. It was not a very populated time. How could so few people create this kind of an effect? And even more strange, look at that effect. So on the bottom you see population growth in human populations for the last 7,000 years. And you see a very clear exponential pattern. So why would you see a very gentle linear pattern, just a gradual decline in carbon dioxide and methane associated with that very low level of population, and then exponentially increasing? How could those two things possibly go together? Good question, right? And actually, Bill was a little bit dumbfounded by that, and he wasn't sure how to deal with that claim so easily. But it turns out there's a very good reason. There's a very good explanation for why you would expect to see this pattern from human clearing of land. And this is because when people did agriculture 5,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago, they did not have the plow. They did not have, all the technologies that we have, and they did have all the land they could possibly ever use. Imagine being the first settler here on the Great Plains, showing up with an opportunity, right? You didn't have to really worry so much about how high your yields were, because land was unlimited. And that was the way agriculture began. So the earliest users of land used as much land as they could, and their main objective, and it's also objective probably most agriculturalists share to this day, is to minimize their labor. Right? Why would you do more work than you need to farm? And it's pretty easy to set fire to a forest and throw some seeds out there. So that's what everybody did until there was no longer enough land to get the production that you need to feed the people that you have with that kind of practice. And that encouraged people to bump up. So the first level of agriculture was really what they're called these long fallow systems, where people would burn the forest, plant some seeds, use the land for maybe 1 year, and come back 25 years later, 10 years later. The land didn't get reused very much, so they would keep clearing land after land after land, because that was the easy way to get the fertility, the lowest labor way of farming. And that uses a lot of land per person. That's the key there. In the very early days, you're using a lot of land per person. Then, of course, the fallows get shorter, and people start cropping every year. That's a big change in the amount of land you need per person. It goes way down. And finally, in a lot of areas where I worked in China, for example, people will grow 3 crops a year. That's a routine thing. So you can get more from the same land, but you only do it when you have to. You don't just do it because you can. So if you take a reasonable approach and just assume that back in the day when people had as much land as they wanted, that they farmed a lot like shifting cultivators who also farm that way do today, then they need a lot more land per person to farm 5,000 years ago than they do today. So you're starting off on that top chart there with this higher level of land per person. And that's going to decrease to contemporary levels that we know, right, which are orders of magnitude less, usually at least 1 order of magnitude less than they were in this early period. And if you do that and you combine that with the amount of people on Earth at different periods and how much land would be cleared, you get the second chart. You're looking at these different pathways for getting to contemporary rates. And even though we don't know exactly that pathway globally, you can still get an interesting pattern that doesn't look like the pattern of population. It looks different than the pattern of population. The most interesting thing, though, is the rate at which people would have had to clear land in order to sustain that population with that change in the amount of land per person. And there you get that interesting pattern on the bottom. That's the rate of land clearing. People are clearing in an accelerating mode with a kind of a hump in the middle. About 5,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, people are kind of peaking in the amount of land used, the rates at which they are clearing land thousands of years ago. That's just the simple math of combining this declining rate of land use per person and exponential population growth. You put those two together, you don't get exponential clearing of land. You get actually a peak that occurs a long time ago. So that was an interesting theoretical look at how you could explain the early use of land on a very large scale, the early clearing of land early in the Holocene. Not everybody buys that. It's not essential that you understand that or agree with it, and it could be proved false. Either way, the fact is we now live in a planet that is profoundly different than anything that could occur without humans. And perhaps the simplest observation that you could make coming from outer space to look at this planet and to see how much it's changed is looking at the fact that the Earth now glows at night. I don't know if you've seen, this is just an image that I'm sure many of you have seen in different places. There's also some interesting animations that have been taken off of the International Space Station where you can see the glowing of the Earth at night. The first thing to think about when you see the glowing of the Earth at night, okay, that's clearly not precedented in the history of the Earth. There was no other period where the Earth glowed at night, perhaps during a volcanic period very early on. So it's unusual that way. And you can also take the other question, which is, all right, so is the reason that the Earth glows at night because there's so many people? Do we have like little lights on the back that kind of light up, so the more people we have, the brighter we get? That doesn't explain this process at all. The reason that we have that lit up Earth is because we have, over many generations, built up a knowledge base, a technical base, an infrastructure base, a coherent, assembled system of energy generation and use, right, that has enabled us to transform the entire planet into a planet that glows at night. It's not something that any of us can do. It requires all of us acting together, and it is not intentional that we light the Earth to space, right? We don't do it for that reason. It's the emergent properties of our activities that we do unintentionally. That is the transformative force of humans. It's the human system. It's the emergent properties of all of us interacting together, fulfilling our needs for power in this case, but it's that transformative global effect that has generated the unprecedented change that is the Anthropocene, the new geological epoch that has been generated by the sustained interaction of humans with the Earth system over the long term. And of course, if The Economist says it's true, it must be true. I'm just going to start off with a few simple messages about the Anthropocene, okay? There's lots of people for a long time, you can go back to the ancient Greeks perhaps, talking about humans as disturbing or destroying nature. There's not anything new about that idea, or that humans are causing global change. I think you've heard that many, many times, okay? And the Anthropocene fits into that to some degree if you want it to. But one of the most important concepts about the Anthropocene is, as I mentioned, it's a geological time period. It's a geological epoch. It's not a geologic event. That is at least the proposal here. The proposal for a new geological epoch means that this is a period that is very long in the history of the Earth, at least long enough to be significant, on the order of, say, 10,000 years or so. So it's nothing temporary. It's permanent as far as we're concerned. Geologic time is much slower than our individual time. It may occur at the time of human systems, but not at the time of human individuals. So it is a permanent change as far as we're concerned. And it has led to the transformation of ecology across the planet. That's what I'm going to talk about next. And that we must now consider the human system. Not humans. Not the organisms that are humans, but the human system, the emergent properties of what we've built and what we continue to use as our support network, that has become an Earth system. And on the par with something just as like the climate system or the biosphere, you cannot predict the future of the Earth without being able to predict the future of the human system. The greatest change that humans have ever made on this planet to date is agriculture. And I know that may sound shocking to some people, maybe not to others, but I'm hoping that this will continue to be true. Right now, to date, global climate change, and that climate change I talked about before, that early Holocene climate change, should it be true that it was anthropogenic, that humans caused this climate change, it's not very big. In fact, it's hard to measure. The one we're doing right now, so far, is also on that order. It's not that big yet. It's not huge. In 50 years, it will become much bigger. And in 100 years, it will become very, very big. and will overcome perhaps many of the other things we've done in the past. I hope not. We still have the chance to move away from that future. But the bottom line is, if you're looking at what we've done to date, agriculture is the biggest change. And right now we have currently put under use about 40% of Earth's land surface. This statistic is old. About 40% of Earth's land surface, ice-free land surface, is now in use directly for crops, pastures, and urban areas. That's not included there, but it's a smaller area. So this idea that we can understand the biosphere as a system formed under climate and sustained by these long-term interactions with the climate system is really not going to adequately describe the ecological patterns that we now have in the face of the changes of agriculture. So with a colleague, Naveen Ramankutty, a number of years ago, I guess it was 2007, we set out to try to look at what are the global patterns of ecology sustained by direct human interactions with ecosystems. And the simplest way, we didn't know exactly how to characterize this, but we felt that the simplest way to look at this would be to look at the global patterns of population and the way we use land around the world. And we use this concept of anthropogenic biomes, the human biomes, the global patterns of ecology created by sustained direct interaction with humans as our paradigm for looking at this. And again, like I said, we didn't know exactly what these patterns should be, or how big they should be, etc. So we set out with a statistical approach, an empirical approach, to try and characterize this. So we started off with population data from around the world. We used cropland data, pasture data, irrigated area, because that obviously sustains a type of agriculture that's going to be very different than what you'd see without it. Rice, which is one of the most ancient and most transformative agricultural systems, and the natural cover of, or actually the current cover of trees and bare earth across the earth. And we stuck this into a meat grinder, a statistical system called cluster analysis. In this case, we used a system that actually allowed us to determine both the types of globally significant patterns across these data and how many significant patterns we should be looking for. We used an algorithm that basically chose both of those factors. So we ended up with essentially a set of global patterns that are the most statistically significant patterns in all those variables. Those are the anthropogenic biomes. What are the globally significant patterns sustained by direct human interactions with ecosystems? And so you get this nice map. We had to characterize these a little bit more. You get this nice map of these different global patterns sustained by direct human interactions with ecosystems. And so the first thing to do, I think, is to take a look at what these tell us about the global patterns of the biosphere in the Anthropocene, with humans having modified them. And of course, the first place to start, as we always do when we teach this, is with a natural pattern. So what's left of the wild biosphere? And there is a significant amount left. But as you'll notice from the map, I think it's fairly clear here, although it's a little washed out, is that these tend to be in the north. They tend to be in the colder places. And one very important statistic, I think, for those of us who think about the biosphere as being composed mostly of wild places like wild forests, is that only about 20% of the world's tree cover today is within areas that have no human populations or land use. And that's our definition of wildlands, no population or land use. So actually, it's not the majority, it's the minority. So when you think of biosphere, there's a tendency to visualize tropical rainforests. I know I still do it, even with years of trying to retrain myself to look more realistically at what we see on Earth. This tends to be synonymous with the idea of the biosphere. And there are indeed significant areas of Earth's land that remain without use or population that are tropical rainforests, although they perhaps maybe do have some people under there. But this is really, when you think wildlands today, this is really what you should be thinking about. An area that is too dry or too cold to be of great interest to those who would do agriculture or live there. The reason that they're still wild is because they're very unproductive. And that is the main state of wild nature today. It's these less productive areas. A much larger category is what we call semi-natural ecosystems. And these are ecosystems that have low levels of use. Less than 20% of the land is used for some purpose like crops or pastures, and relatively low population densities. You can see a huge amount of Earth's forest cover falls into that category. So that's a much more important general category than a wild forest. And you can see these all over the world. Here's an example from the tropics in Thailand. Here's an example that might look familiar to many of you. Maybe there's even a part of Iowa that looks a little like this, deciduous forest. But of course, where I'm from, this is a very common thing. And it's a secondary forest. This is not a forest that has the huge trees of a pristine forest. It's regrown. And it's still populated and has use in it. And this would be an example from China of a semi-natural woodland that you can see is basically taken care of in many different ways by many different people. It doesn't resemble at all the kind of forest that would have been there before. So even though you'd still call it, maybe this one you'd have to call a woodland, not a forest, even though it has a very big difference in its natural patterns, it's still basically a forest. Rangelands, very extensive in the world, and these occur primarily where you have drier regions, just like they do in North America. You see this pattern all over the world. They don't tend to be very densely populated, and of course they don't have much tree cover. But still, even though we might tend to consider rangelands, these areas that have extensive areas of pastures, as being no populations and just cattle, for example, there's a lot of areas of the world where you have very ancient rangeland ecosystems. This is in Morocco, actually at the center of origin for alfalfa near the Atlas Mountains. And this place is a place, obviously, where people have been running rangelands since very early times. Croplands. And of course, great interest in croplands here in Iowa, and I think most of Iowa in my system is classified as croplands. These are areas, of course, that are dominated by cropped areas, but I think one thing that is obvious, even if you just look out of the airplane or drive around here, is that croplands are not just crops. That's one of the most important things to realize about croplands today. And if you look at a statistic there on that chart, you're going to see something that's kind of shocking. 25% of the world's tree cover is embedded within croplands. And you might notice that that's a bigger number than the amount of wild forests on Earth. So arguably, people who manage croplands are responsible for managing more of the Earth's forests, although they're rarely forests, actually. They're smaller patches of trees. But most of the world's tree cover compared to a wild forest. And so even though there is a tendency to think of croplands like this, and of course they are present in many areas, especially in the United States, areas that basically are just crops, this is the most common form of cropland around the world, what we call the rain-fed mosaic cropland. And you can see why it's called a mosaic composed of patches of different things. Okay? The most common form of cropland is a pattern that includes residential developments of one type or another and includes some level of tree cover. This is the most common form of croplands worldwide. And you can see this everywhere. This is in France, by the way. It's not the US, even though it looks exactly like maybe parts of Pennsylvania, maybe even parts of Iowa look almost exactly like this. And of course I had to get a photo coming down in the airplane. Croplands here. Also, even though most of it does look like it's just crop fields, there's also a fair amount of other things, and those other things add up. They're important globally because croplands are so important globally. Villages, very dear to my heart. They're in a sense a form of croplands and rangelands that are very densely populated. They're populated at levels that resemble suburbs here in the United States. So in those situations, generally you're going to see an ancient agricultural system. It takes a long time to build up populations like that in agricultural systems. And so they tend to have a different form. They're more mature in sense as agricultural systems. And their dense populations mean that a lot of the basic functions of cities occur in these villages. And they support almost as many people as urban areas. And I should note that there are small urban areas embedded within the village landscapes to some degree. They're not so extensive on Earth, but as you'll see in a moment, they're much more extensive than cities. There's one of my favorite anthropogenic biomes, or anthromes, the rice village. Very ancient, very densely populated, very productive. Another from Sichuan, you can really see the mosaic pattern here. Even in this very densely populated, very ancient agricultural landscape, you've got this real mosaic of different land uses, a multifunctional landscape in which they're doing forestry, cropping, living there. Everything's occurring within a relatively small area and has done so for a long time. I couldn't say thousands for sure in this landscape, but at least 1,000 years here. And of course, finally we get to the urban settlements. Not a huge area on Earth. Around 1% of Earth's land could be categorized this way. And it's growing pretty quickly, but the fact is that urban areas are fairly dense. And so you can put a lot of people into them without expanding them so much. Unless, of course, you live in LA or something, then you have to grow out. And I guess Iowa, you guys are getting some nice sprawling development too. But the bottom line is a relatively compact form of anthropogenic biome, really wholly transformed by human activity. We do tend to think of, well, maybe you folks don't, but I tend to think of, when I hear urban, I think of, say, New York or some other super dense city like that. And even though those are growing all over the world, like in China, more common is your actual kind of middle-sized city in some developing country. In terms of the global extent of the world's urban areas, that's more common than, say, these really dense, compact areas. And, of course, I have to show a slide of wonderful Baltimore. There's some row houses there, and you can see even in a dense row house environment, we've got somewhat of a mosaic going on there in the yards. So if we look at the world globally through this new anthropogenic biosphere lens, what is the biosphere that we've created? People are very concentrated in this biosphere. About 80% of all people live in urban and village anthromes. So it is true, the densely settled anthropogenic biomes are where most people live. If we look at the world's land, you see about a quarter of the world's land can still be categorized as wild by our definition of having no people or significant use of land. And about 3/4 are in some state of anthropogenic modification, human modification. And just to bring it home again, the wild forest area of the world is less than the area of cities and villages on Earth. So cities and villages are every bit as important to the world's ecology as wild forests, if you just consider their area. If you consider the primary productivity of the biosphere, the net primary productivity, that's what that NPP means, that's the photosynthesis by plants, right? It's where energy comes into ecosystems. If you look at where that's distributed, only about 10% of the world's net primary production is occurring within wildland areas. And that's because of what we described before. This very low productivity area is the type of area that tends to be left wild. And all the high productivity areas are transformed by people living there or using the land. And so for that reason, wild forest net primary production tends to be much lower at a global scale than the amount in the densely populated anthropogenic biomes, which is, it's kind of surprised me, but it's actually, based on the evidence, it's true. And a full third of the world's net primary production occurs within croplands. And that doesn't mean it occurs within crops, right? Because as I said, croplands are mosaics. They have a large amount of forest embedded within them. And actually a lot of that primary productivity is there because trees are very productive. With crops, one interesting thing we found is that a full 3/4 of the world's croplands are relatively densely populated. And maybe right around here would be an example of that. If you get further out into Iowa, I'm guessing less population density. But a large amount of the world's cropland isn't just uninhabited areas with just a few farmers in them. Another thing we found is that most of the irrigation and rice land is in villages, these most densely populated areas. So you could argue that it's the kind of thing that develops with population density, just like I described earlier. This idea that people use land more intensively, make it more productive, get more out of it when they have to, when they're crowded into it, than when they're not. You see that effect, at least at the global scale, with these villages having the most productive agriculture on average. And then, again, I'm just going to drive home again, 1/4 of the world's tree cover embedded within croplands. Another way to look at all of this is just to look at it real simple. Let's just take 3 categories and divide the world up into them. And one we have is wildlands, right? And these are these areas without direct use by humans or human populations. And then we have these used areas for crops, pastures, and settlements, right? So there's 2 categories. So we've got about 3/4 covered there. But we have another category, and that's all the stuff in between. The stuff embedded within those used landscapes that is no longer wild. It has been transformed by proximity and maybe even prior use in the landscape, and has been transformed by that into a new state, a novel state. It's not a wild ecosystem. It may resemble one, but it is no longer a wild ecosystem. How did we get here? How did we transform the biosphere? This was a question that was asked very early when I did that first paper on looking at, what were the global patterns? How do we get these global patterns? So we looked at the history of this evolution. If you look at the biosphere in 1700 from this same idea of anthropogenic biomes, you see basically about half of the world's land even then would not be considered wild. However, the part that is transformed, the part that is anthropogenic, is mostly semi-natural. It's not intensively used at that time. That's a smaller category. And as we get closer into the current time, you're seeing the expansion of this very intensively used anthropogenic biomes expanding at the expense of the semi-natural areas that are used at low levels become used at very high levels, and areas that are used at low levels are getting shrunk. They're getting used up, and the wildlands are also getting used up. So you have two processes going on that are transforming the biosphere. One is, of course, pioneering and using new areas of wildlands. That's one big one, and of course that happened here during that period in Iowa. It was 300 years ago. There was no croplands here that I know of. So the other effect is the increasing intensification of use on the areas that have already been mildly used. So those are the two big patterns. We took another look and stepped even further back into history, and of course the data gets poorer at that point. So poor, in fact, that we have controversies even over some of the most basic estimates of historical land use. And I would say this is an example of one of the more, not extreme, but more intensive looks at how much use was going on in prehistory in the early periods of the Anthropocene. The early periods of the Holocene, say 8,000 years ago. And you can see that some areas of the world had very early use, much earlier than others. And you can see one reason perhaps why North Americans don't really think of the world having a long history of land use is because in North America there isn't so much of that, except maybe to some of the northern and Central American parts of the biosphere. Either way, the question right now, we've talked about the age of transformation of the biosphere and that we've transformed it. We now have this biosphere that's about 40% used, it's about a quarter wild, and it's got this other novel ecosystems in between. So let's talk a little bit about that. One of the fundamentals that we found when we looked at these patterns around the world is that unlike the patterns of the natural or wild biosphere, in which you're going to categorize a very large global pattern like tropical rainforest, as essentially one thing. It's just a lot of trees, basically, of a certain species interacting with each other, and it's a relatively homogeneous type of ecosystem. Now, a lot of ecologists might dispute how homogeneous, how simple a tropical rainforest is, but the basic idea there is that a grassland, a rainforest, they're relatively simple individual types of systems. With anthropogenic biomes, or anthromes, we don't have that. Anthromes are mosaics. Whenever we use land, almost in every case, we have exceptions to this for sure, but the general pattern that we see is that people use different parts of the land differently. They assemble mosaics of different forms of use in the landscape, which leads to the fact that a smaller amount of Earth's land, 40% of Earth's land, can change another third, almost to another equal amount of Earth's land into these novel ecosystems because they're breaking out, they're fragmenting, breaking out the different parts of the landscape into used and lesser used or even unused parts. They're creating these mosaics in which novel ecosystems, the patterns of nature that are influenced by proximity or direct use by humans, but not over the long term, are these novel ecosystems. So if you look at the global patterns of novel ecosystems around the world, these are areas that are essentially not directly used, but embedded within a used landscape. You can see these are common all over the world, except actually Iowa, you might notice, is not a great place to find novel ecosystems in general because here the land is used more completely. So there's not so much left over in the landscape compared to a lot of other landscapes around the world. Maybe Matt can change this one of these days, but the bottom line is you see these generally all over the world. And if you look at their age, you can find that most places in the world, these are also fairly old. They're hundreds of years old. They've been transformed. They've been influenced for long periods. So even though a novel ecosystem may seem like something new, in fact, a lot of them have been influenced by humans for quite some time. They're not actually something very young necessarily. And they have a context. And usually I'm giving a talk like this, not to agriculturalists, but to ecologists or conservation biologists. They're very interested in these global patterns of nature created by humans. And one of the first things that people are interested in is how the way that humans have transformed land and how the landscape context within which the land that is left behind is left. For example, if you're trying to conserve a forest, if it's embedded within an urban area, your forest conservation strategy is going to be very different than if it's embedded in a cropland or in a semi-natural area where there's very low levels of use. So the context, the way that people are using the landscape around the novel ecosystem is a big constraint on both what patterns you'd expect to see in those forests or other types of ecosystems, and in how you would attempt to conserve them. So it matters. And a good example of this is thinking of a forest. Forests are not just forests when they're embedded within a used landscape. And there's lots of examples of how the human context, the way that the land is used around these forests, and the way the forests may have either recovered or been surrounded by use, will influence the ecology of those systems. So some of the forests are actually just used landscapes, just like croplands in some ways, and some are recovering or are just disturbed by external activity. So again, it's this idea that by essentially enwrapping 40% or so of the biosphere around our used areas, or embedding them within our used areas, we are transforming them into new types of ecosystems, novel ecosystems. So this brings me to what more or less the last phase of my talk, where I'm going to speak more or less like a global ecologist, looking at some of the challenges that we have in trying to understand an anthropogenic biosphere and trying to work with it in a way that will be beneficial to humans over the long term. And one of these is to look at some of the things that really matter that we're not necessarily properly considering at global scale. Everyone, whether you believe in it or not, has heard of global climate change. But I'm not sure that everyone has heard of global landscape fragmentation. And maybe a lot of people have. But the idea here is that the way that we make that mosaic, the way that we put our used land into wildlands and then create semi-natural lands, the way that we break up the landscape has a big effect on what happens to all the other species that are living in that landscape. The fragmentation matters. And we actually have extremely poor data on this. We have much better data on climate change than we do on things like even road networks around the world. It's really striking when you start studying this, how poor our understanding is in some ways of the other things that we're doing. We do know where the agriculture is, but there's some other things. One thing we discovered by looking at where are ecologists making observations in the field. And this was work that was pioneered by Laura Martin, who basically spent an entire summer taking all the journal articles in the top 10 journals in ecology and making maps of where they were doing their studies and categorizing where the areas were that they were studying. They looked at these sites to see what were ecologists looking at. What is our ecology based on in the textbook? What observations are used? And what we found was very interesting in that there's a real paucity, a real rareness to observing the most common parts of the biosphere. The anthropogenic biomes are understudied, in a sense. We're not really looking at the right places if we're trying to understand the ecology that we've created. There's a real bias against that in ecology. And I think that it's really something that agriculturalists and ecologists need to work out, is how to share their understanding of how the biosphere really works today. Another big factor, we know less about the global patterns at which our economics are influencing things. And I think you all know, right, from year to year the price of corn and soybeans changes, and that changes the whole biosphere. The whole biosphere is sensitive to market forces today. Whether that's land clearing or decisions about what you do, the market influence on agriculture and other patterns, development of cities, is a huge influence on the biosphere. If we're going to understand the future of the biosphere, we need to understand those things. We also have a hard time looking at the totality of what we've really done in terms of biodiversity. And I must say first that what I'm going to talk about here, patterns of plant species richness, how many plant species you find in a given area of land, it does not tell you anything necessarily about what you'd see with mammals or birds. But if you're just looking at what's happened to plants as people have come into landscapes and started to use them, bringing with them crops, bringing with them species that they either wanted to add or unintentionally added to the landscape. What's happened as we've eaten away at the habitats that were there before to biodiversity? And I would say the first thing about this data is that it's very poor. It's basically a model prediction. It is not really hard data. However, the best knowledge that we have of what we've done in general is kind of striking to a lot of people. The general message that you're going to get about what humans have done to biodiversity is that we've caused extinctions. And that is a fact that we've done that. At global scale, that's pretty much our main effect. We've knocked species out. But actually, plants have not been heavily impacted yet. There's actually not that many plant species that have been knocked out of the global flora of 300,000 species of vascular plants. The most interesting thing in some ways, now we have to stop extinctions, but if you look at in any one landscape, anywhere in the world, what is the big effect of humans? We've actually increased in net the number of species in the landscape, again, by these processes of species addition. Most of them undesired. Perhaps, for example, your greatest additions to Iowa have been all the weeds. It's probably true. That's probably the main number of species that have been added to Iowa thanks to humans. But nevertheless, the net effect you could look at is that we enrich the number of species. So if we want to understand the future of biodiversity on the planet, we have to look realistically at what kinds of effects we're having. It's not just about loss. It's also about how we just shift the communities into these completely new communities by bringing in new species. It's another message for the Anthropocene. And then I guess the most important message is that if you want to know what the biodiversity of the planet is going to be like in 2050, there's only one way to find out, and that's to find out what we're going to do. Because it's going to be up to us. How many species are on Earth in 2050? So that leaves us with the decisions that we need to make, and it's very questionable whether humans have ever made global decisions. It's arguable that maybe we never have made a global decision as a species. And it may never be possible. We don't actually know until we've done it. Arguably, and I'll mention this in a bit, we're probably in a better position to do this than we ever have been in history as well. But the bottom line is, the biosphere that we want in the future is going to depend on some form of influence that hopefully we guide in the future, rather than just allow to happen as we have in the past. And I would say one of the greatest challenges of all in doing this is trying to manage anthromes, trying to manage the terrestrial ecosystems that we create globally. And that's partly because, right, I think all of you know, you can't just go over and walk up to someone's farm and change that place. It's a negotiation with landowners and all the different stakeholders in any landscape. What are the functions that land's going to have? And somebody who owns the land might just say, I just want farming. I don't want any other thing going on my land. You're going to have to work around that. Or there's other opportunities to introduce some type of other land management into that system. But the fact is, if you want there to be any native grassland or any restored grassland in the world, it's going to happen in agricultural landscapes. It's not going to happen by protecting something out there. That option no longer exists in most of the biomes, and grasslands are probably the best example of a part of the earth that we've transformed almost so completely that the only possibility of having any of it to pass on to future generations is to actually pull back a bit from what we've already done. So that's a challenge. Can we manage multifunctional landscapes globally? And there's no doubt about it. This is an amazing challenge. Perhaps the greatest challenge. People talk about climate change being the greatest challenge. I would argue this is just as great a challenge, is to try to find ways to make space for the rest of nature in our used landscapes. And I think the desire is there. I think the will is there. We want that to happen. I think almost everybody wants that to happen somehow. But the challenge is in really making it happen. And it's made no easier by the fact that the landscapes that we create are mosaics, and they're dynamic. They are changing all the time. When I show this slide to people, and this is another example of looking at the kind of patterns that we've created. This one's a little bit more kind of statistical than direct observation, but it's a look at essentially the connected, dramatically changed, and dynamic world that the Anthropocene represents. First question is, what do you feel about this picture? I find that there's a real breakpoint in most audiences where a very substantial group will feel, my God, now we've done it all. The earth it's all over. I mean, how can the earth survive this onslaught by humanity? We've just taken it all over. But I'll tell you what I do see here. It's true. We have become a force of nature as powerful as anything on the planet. There's no doubt about that. But I see the possibilities here. We are better connected, better able to work with each other than ever in history. Never before has Homo sapiens become essentially connected individual to individual globally. That's a unique period of history. It's never happened. And we have the ability also to sit in a room like this together and see a visualization of the whole Earth. It is a normative thing for us to understand the world that way. That's new also. So we live in a time when it actually is possible to connect to each other, unless you're in China. In this case, you're not going to be connected to Facebook because it's not allowed. But generally, we have the ability to work with each other and to communicate, even if it's about, what you ate for lunch. Either way, we have the means, if we want, if we have the desire, the will, to put together a better biosphere. And this is something that's probably maybe more important for the folks that I work with, usually ecologists, but the idea is that humans make it easier to have change. It makes it easier when people are there to actually implement good things. Because people locally understand their environments to a very great extent. And when you partner with local people, there is the potential to make amazing change. So the idea that people are the cause of the problem really is the opposite of the truth. The opportunity comes from the people. We have new opportunities to connect with people through technology that will enable us potentially to connect around environment and management in ways that are really unique in history. Again, that doesn't mean that we're very good at this. We haven't become experts at governing the environment or even governing ourselves, right? And we still have wars. They're not necessarily good for anyone, but we do have them. So it's a good thing that nature is not weak. Nature is powerful. And that's another important thing to remember about the Anthropocene, is it's certainly not going to be the last geological epoch. Nature will continue. Nature will build on the substrate that we leave behind. It's already doing that. It's an interaction and an interplay with nature that we have. But the fact is that we are basically building the substrate upon which the nature of this century and beyond in the Anthropocene is going to be built on. We can build it differently. There's not just one way that we can do things, and we are changing this in a lot of ways. This is obviously not something we do now, but is it possible for people to live densely and still have lots of land around them? Maybe it is. There's some tricks we still got left in that bag of tricks that we've put out there before. And I also show this one mostly to ecologists for the simple reason that when they see this, and maybe you get the same feeling, it's a wonderful natural place. But in fact, this is not a natural place. The only reason this place looks like this is because they decided not to build a reservoir there, like they did in its sister. The Hetchy Hetchy Reservoir was flooded. This was a decision. This was a land use. Nature is a land use. Nature is a decision. Nature isn't something that just happens out there anymore. It comes from active human engagement. So you're not going to have any nature unless you make it happen. And that can be beautiful. The idea that the nature that we create is an end game, a disaster, an environmental problem, is not necessarily the truth. There's a lot of beauty in the nature we create as well. It's not the end of the world. This is just an example of Iowa. Maybe you consider this beautiful, maybe you don't. But either I would kind of say this is beautiful because there's a lot of energy coming off of this landscape. It's producing a lot. And the whole world needs this energy. The whole world needs this food. The idea that just because we're operating an intense managed landscape doesn't mean that it's not a beautiful thing in the Anthropocene. And I think just closing messages here, that we need to think about a new story, and I especially direct this toward people who teach. If you're a teacher at any level, you're probably going to teach something about the story of the biosphere and how you start off with this kind of natural biosphere, the patterns of the biomes, and then humans come and disturb them. And I think in the Anthropocene, and I mean now, we need a new message that we tell young people, a new science that explains the reality is that we've been in a pattern of human transformed nature for a very long time. We've already transformed nature. What we're doing now is passing on the nature that we've created to the next generation. So it's up to us what happens. We are the stakeholders and the stewards of nature. So these are the four last words of the talk I want to give about how we should think about agriculture and the biosphere in the Anthropocene. The first is that it's ancestral. passing it on, and it's been passed on to us. It's not new, and it's not temporary, and it's necessary. We need to value it. It's a mosaic. You can't just think about one part of the landscape as being what is important. All those parts need to fit together. You need to have some areas that are not used in the areas that are used in order to really get the main benefits from the nature that we created. We need to think globally about all of it, right? Just because you're here in Iowa and it's the best place to produce corn and soybeans maybe in the entire earth, it doesn't mean that globally there's not also a need for the grassland ecosystems that lived here, because this might be the only place where they can exist as well. Nevertheless, you're connected to the global market. Maybe the market will decide what Iowa should be. It's up to you. And then finally, that it's permanent. That there really is no other solution than to manage the biosphere that we've created and the biosphere that we will create for our future benefit. There's no other alternative on Earth. There's no saving a world outside of our reach. It's all within our reach now. We've transformed almost all of it already. And so permanent is another way to look at agriculture, the ecology of the future. All right, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll take any questions. Hopefully I got people thinking at least.
Well, I have a question.
Oh, great.
What type of human stewardship do you think we need to practice to maintain the biodiversity? Do we need to increase the production of crops? Do we need more diversity?
Yeah. Well, I'm guessing you're coming from a production environment, but I might be wrong. But this is the fact, is that we need both. And that sounds like a contradiction, right? That we need to both increase production. Places like Iowa are so near the maximum production that is available with current technology compared to other parts of the world that maybe increasing production isn't such an important thing here, but sustaining production is. I don't think it's necessarily wise to reduce the productivity of a system like this at a time like this where populations are growing. We do think, demographers at least think, that population is going to plateau. And it's going to plateau probably within the next 30 years. And dietary preferences will sometime plateau too, I would assume. Even as they, in some ways, roll back in the United States. We're not eating so much meat as we were. So I would say that in the short term at least, the production needs to stay relatively high. But the fascinating thing is that you don't need to take that much land out to keep product and to actually have a fair amount of nature conservation, to have the biodiversity come back. And I think Matt's work has shown some of this, but it's a pretty common thing in landscape ecology that certain types of environments don't need to be that large if they're structured well. So if there's a coherent plan, now it gets much easier to do that if people work together. So if all the farmers in an area, for example, are going to work together to create some conservation land, they can much more effectively do that with less area than if, say, one guy does it and the other guy doesn't, so everything's broken apart in the landscape. You put it all together, put in corridors and this sort of thing, small amounts of area can have a huge impact. In fact, the smaller amounts have the biggest impact. You get the biggest bang for the buck when you've got none, actually, and just create a little.
Yeah, Russ Courier from Des Moines. Couple decades ago, there were a couple scientists, I think it was a husband and wife, who advocated for Buffalo Commons, which would be to convert western Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, etc., into basically returning it to the prairie state. They didn't endear themselves to Senator Dole in the process, but how would you feel about something as vast as that?
Well, I think that the market has already decided that one. I don't think, rolling back, the cost of taking that much land out of production is, especially with the prices of commodities, which are really, the thermometer for the demand globally, says grow lots of food right now. And I don't think that thermometer the temperature is going to go down in the short term. It's going to go up. The demand, I think so. It's hard to say with markets, right? Because markets go up and down no matter what you do. But I think the general trend into, I'd say 2050 at least, is a general trend toward increasing demand globally for food. And given the productivity of some of these areas, like Kansas and Iowa, these places, I mean, it's hard to justify turning that into buffalo land at this moment in history. Maybe at some moment in history it will make sense. And that doesn't mean that you can't have buffalo land and still have that productivity. I mean, I think it's kind of uncreative. It's kind of backward thinking to think it's all or nothing, right? You either got to take Kansas and turn it into buffalo land, or there's no buffalo land. There's a lot of middle ground there, and I think that finding that middle ground is really the key to that multifunctional landscape that can produce and be land for the buffalo. That's an opportunity. That's real if we are smart enough to take advantage of it.
Let me confess that I'm one of the people who saw that image of the communication routes and the airlines and the shipping routes and was inclined to think, first of all, oh my God, it's all over, right? And you have a very hopeful image of that, but I think if I understand it, your hopeful image depends on our ability to communicate at the international level. And I look at recent efforts at international communication of that sort, international negotiations to control climate, other international negotiations designed to protect the environment, and I have trouble working up the optimism. So I'd love to have you say something that would help me.
Let me give it a
more
shot.
Optimistic about
I'll
that.
try and find something optimistic to say here. But actually, I have discussed regularly. At my university, we get pretty regular visits by folks who study the sociology of science and who look specifically at, for example, the negotiations around carbon and climate. And I've asked every one of them that I've had a chance to have lunch with or whatever. Okay, so is there a prospect for global international agreements to solve climate change? And the ones who know the most always say one thing: no. There's no prospect for an international agreement to solve climate change right now. And of course, that's just an opinion. But I think I think there's some truth to that. But you know what? The interesting thing is they also say that doesn't mean it can't happen. And the reason is because governments and nations are actually the poorest negotiators in this scenario. Nations are really not the right players to get involved in this kind of thing. There's many, many reasons politically why it's impossible to change the price of gasoline, for example. Yet, does that mean that nothing's changed with the environment? There's no one else able to act on these things? And what you find is that there's a lot of players actually out there outside of the government that have managed to make some very significant differences, like carbon trading and stuff like that is carried on in spite of the government efforts right now. But that's just one example. I think with conservation organizations, the rule is that they're not governmental. In fact, most of the most effective ones are non-governmental, like the Nature Conservancy. And I see a lot of ways in which non-governmental organizations and I wouldn't say cross-national, cross-cultural boundaries can actually be shifted better outside of international boundaries in some ways, rather than through the international negotiations. So it is possible that international negotiations are not going to be that important for really transforming the planet toward more beneficial outcomes for humanity, that the nations, in a sense, aren't really the best players for this. And you can see a lot of emerging things going on that have brought people together around other strategies for solving these problems. So yeah, the bad news is I think you're right. I think it's very unlikely that we're suddenly going to get, all the nations are suddenly going to start, singing in harmony all of a sudden. But I can see some other negotiations taking place that perhaps are the real route for the future. I would put my eggs more in that basket.
Thanks for your presentation, Dr. Ellis. I'm Ben Carr. I'm a graduate student in ag mineralogy here. And I just have a quick question. I mean, your proposal is encouraging in the fact that small change can lead to great impact in this reverse idea, coming from the meteorology background. Definitely have looked at the world in the natural biosphere idea that humans are influencing. But have you had a lot of success? I mean, you're talking about this sort of distant idea in some ways. Have you had any success in convincing people on a personal level to change their habits, to do things that are more embedded, like you're proposing?
Good question. So on a personal level, I don't really have a specific agenda on the personal level for convincing people. I don't think. It's funny, I don't think I go up to people and I feel like I want them to think differently necessarily on an individual level. But here I am definitely trying to convince folks of a different point of view at a broader scale. And so, what do I think? I mean, I teach, and there's where I get a chance to interact with people over a longer period of time and kind of see how their thinking changes. And I think I have had an impact on that. And I think that let me give you one example of one of the problems I think that climate change has had, is that there's been this message around climate change that it's a disaster and we have to avoid it. And, that's one way to look at it. And it's a perfectly reasonable way to look at it. But it's not a very convincing way for everyone. Some people are going to take that message and go, okay, I better do something about it. But for a lot of people, that's disempowering. It feels like, okay, the world's going to end, now I'm really depressed. That doesn't get me going. So sometimes a more motivational approach is to say, how good can we make the world? What can we do to make it better? Because we do have that power. It's not necessarily true. We may not even be able to stop climate change. I hope that we can. I'm not convinced that we will. I'm also convinced that it's not the end of the world. It will be the end of the world as we know it. No question about that, right? The climate system of the future without, abatement of climate change as we're doing it now is a planet that's totally transformed. I mean, kids it won't resemble what we have now. But I'm convinced that humans are, as a force of nature right now, in a position to live with that. So it'll be looked on negatively, I think, by future generations. They will say, why did these people do this? Right? You might say, though, maybe some of you feel like, why did people plow up the entire prairie and not leave any of it for nature? Right? I think some people feel that way now. So that's a kind of a general condition, is this transformational thing. But that doesn't mean that, you can't put a little bit of it back now. The prairie's not totally gone. It's not like there's nothing left. There's nothing to do. We're powerless to have some prairie that we want. Right? We can get some of that back. And I think putting that in the messaging has been empowering for a lot of students, I think, in a different way. Instead of trying to affect change just by trying to stop us from doing things, it's also about trying to empower people to do things. And I think that message is stuck with some folks. I don't have a gauge overall about it.
Have you done some analysis through the lens of sustainability? In other words, balancing economic viability with environmental benefit and social equity or quality of life, but also looking at some of the big issues that you addressed tonight in terms of global warming, continuing natural resource extraction, accumulating waste on the earth? Yeah, well, truth is I got interested in all this kind of stuff. What kind of led to where I am now is, sustainable ag was my first interest back in the late 80s, early 90s. And that kind of led me to where I am now. And so I do think about things generally that way. There are some conundrums, though, with the way that the human system works. And it's often,
it's hard to predict the future of what people want. So what people want now may be very different than what people want in 100 years. And so I felt that often that it's very hard to, I'll give you an example. Working in China for a long time, you work with traditional folks who have gone through the transition to a more industrial system. And on the one hand, they've lost a lot. They've lost a traditional system. And there is a feeling of loss about that, and the traditional livelihood strategies and the way it was to be in a village, in the old days. But on the other hand, they never want to go back. And so there's a need for two things: sustainability, but also, I have to say, progress. It's a bad word in some ways to some people, progress, because it's often poorly defined. What does it mean? It means different things to different people. But the idea that people don't want to just have the same thing in the next generation. They want something better. That's a pretty human drive all over the world, and I think it's not a bad thing. And when you can couple that feeling not of just sustaining, which is in a sense just keeping things going in a way, but also looking for a future that's better in a way, is often more exciting, more engaging for a lot of folks. I mean, here in the West, we've got so much, and they're looking at us and seeing what we have and thinking, there's a lot to be gained. And, denying that to those folks is not our business. And so it's an interesting thing to come to this, and I think it's ultimately going to be a negotiation of sorts, is how the folks that have enjoyed all these benefits of, quote, progress, and continue to enjoy those things, are going to negotiate with the rest of the world getting those things. And that makes the sustainability discussion much more nuanced, I think, when you have to have a negotiation. What's the future that everyone wants? Well, it's different for different people. How do we put that all together? Becomes the real challenge. It's that negotiation among the different folks who are looking for different futures that is the real challenge. I think that's in some ways the biggest challenge for the Anthropocene, how that's going to go on. And it's going to go on at every level, inside a community, across communities. It's a discussion on all those levels. You can't just assume that there's one good, sustainable future.
I have a different aspect, and that is the biosphere that was in Arizona, and I think there's also one in Montreal. Is that, are you connected with that, or has that research and that example, although it was very short term, has that played into this?
I wouldn't say it's played directly into this. However, I definitely use this in teaching. So Biosphere 2 is a great example of how little we know about managing the biosphere. It's a classic, I guess what young folks would say, right, is it's an epic fail, right? Okay. It was, let's just put some people in a box with some glass on it with, diversity from all over the world in it, and, people will prosper in there. And within a couple weeks, they were almost dying in there. They had to remediate it with all sorts of things, and it's, epic fail. So there's no question, and I think that's an important thing to realize. We don't know what we're doing. I'm not sitting here saying we know how to create exactly what we want. I don't think we do. I think, though, that when we put our minds to it, when we have vision for the future rather than vision for avoiding a future, we can get there. We have done that before. We have created new worlds already, an electrified world, for example. It changed everything. And we still have the potential to keep doing that, I think. So I think in some ways a failure of vision is just to avoid a future that is bad, rather than to move toward a future that we all embrace, that we want. And that's a very hard thing because people want different futures. But I see that as a much more engaging strategy than the avoidance kind of strategy. So I think that we can just, instead of just avoiding being like Biosphere 2, we kind of are forced to kind of try and be better than Biosphere 2.
Was part of it the design, or part of it just because it was too short term?
I think it was a combination of essentially lack of science to do the thing. I mean, I think some point we might be able to do something like that.
With the things that we know now, would it still be possible?
They'd have to build it again, and nobody's going to pay for it, I think is the problem. But I think it's probably true that they could do it now. Actually, I think they could do Biosphere 2 now. They did learn a lot from that. That's true. We did learn a lot from that epic fail. In fact, one of the things we learned was about ocean acidification. Another problem we've introduced.
Okay, I'm a little confused by the use of the word wild and how you use that in separating man from, and then because you have one context of wild, you have to have wild in your stomach to digest your food. So when I look at wild through that kind of definition, and I look at wild as what produced the soil, which we could call the carcass, which we're living off of, that kind of puts a different tone to this. I get confused by the manage and the Abrahamic and all this control of, as if it's going to change the outcome of what we have been doing, is control of. Is that clear?
No, I'm confused.
You understand what I mean by the wild. I mean, you've separated humans out from wild, but wild is what allows us to live. And so...
I see what you're saying. Right. Well, honestly, the reason for doing it is because I think it's a common thing that people think of the wild places are the kind of untouched places. Now, there's a lot of reasons to think that that's not really true. And in fact, like there's tropical rainforests that are considered wild. Actually, what I usually present that as is wild lands in our definition is lands that have no evidence in global data of having populations or land use. Because in fact, a lot of those places do have populations. And so, it's quite possible that most areas that I've classified as wild do have people in them anyway. Very small levels of undocumented people, perhaps, but they're there. But yeah, and actually, this has been a discussion with the groups that work on this novel ecosystem concept, which is not my concept, by the way. There's going to be a book on it soon. Is the idea that, in a sense, right now, areas that are kind of untouched don't really exist. And that what I've been describing is the direct influence of people on land, right? Managing land, being there, physically interacting with these places. But of course, climate change touches everything and is touching everything right now. You're already seeing these effects all over the world, so those places are touched too. So in that case, if kind of everything is being touched, then the idea of conserving a nature from before that is something that takes the most effort. Right? In order to stop nature from changing in response to us, you have to put in effort. So actually it takes more effort to maintain a wild place than to actually let it change. So that brings up a whole other concept too, where you also get the idea that what happens if you let a place go? You just let a place be influenced by all the weeds and whatever comes into it, just let it go. That could be, in a sense, considered to be the new wild, right? It's the places that we don't intentionally manage, or we manage to leave them alone, leaving that alone. Because that's very unusual, actually. You won't find many nature preserves where they don't monitor exotic species and try to control them. So it's actually kind of maybe the new wild is just letting those things in. Now, it depends on what we want. Again, it's like people's choices about what we want the future to be like, whether we want places without these exotics in them. We have to decide and negotiate that.
Well, depending on how you define that wild decides on how you make those choices, and I'm not sure it's our choice only. This is the part that I don't understand when you use the word
I see.
wild.
So who else is going to make these choices?
Well, the rest of the non-human world. And that's what global climate change we're talking about, is this uncontrollable ramifications of the decisions that we make.